Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our National Enforcement Conference. This is obviously a very unusual event. Whilst I've been to many enforcement conferences over the past 10 years or more, this is the first time I've spoken to you all from my attic. So welcome to everybody anyway, and thank you all very much for coming. Now, as I don't know, my name is Janet Askew, and I'm an academic, been a lecturer in planning for many, many years. And it gives me great pleasure actually to introduce Neil Harris, because he is one of the few people who actually writes academically about enforcement matters. And he has probably been a source of great inspiration to many of you, many enforcement officers or students who have that ambition to become an enforcement officer. Anybody out there who knows me knows that I'm a real advocate for enforcement. I think that there's no point in having planning rules, planning regulations, unless we enforce them. And I'm very interested in all enforcement matters. So Neil himself, let's introduce Neil. He is a planning academic in the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University, where he teaches on the RTPI's accredited planning courses. And Neil is a chartered town planner, I'm glad to say. And in 2018, Neil was awarded the RTPI's Outstanding Service Award for his involvement in education and his engagement with RTPI Cymru. Neil is one of those very good academics who has spent time in practice and therefore can offer more to students than those who maybe haven't always done that. But he has also worked in development management. But after a time doing that, he decided that he would work in academia. And he now links planning issues with planning theory. Now, this is an interesting aspect, of course, and students always say to me, what's planning theory? What's planning theory got to do with me? Why do I need to learn this? And I always say, well, when you go to work, you will eventually wake up and say, gosh, I really do understand planning theory now, and I really wish I'd listened a bit more when I was a student. But Neil has conducted a lot of research, and he writes about planning enforcement, as I said, and provides advice on a series of different planning topics, ranging from household projections and affordable housing. He's also been very much involved in One Planet development, which he's going to talk about in his talk today, and national strategic planning. So what he says, he's written some of this for me, and he says at the end of it, which made me interested. His interest in planning enforcement stems from wanting to understand why people break rules and how they might be encouraged to comply with them. He consequently finds people walking the wrong direction down supermarket aisles really annoying. And this made me laugh because I thought, well, Neil's talk today will have great resonance for us in our current era, COVID era, if you like, where people are talking all the time now about breaking rules and whether we should break them or whether they shouldn't. And so I think, Neil, you've got a lot to say. So thank you very much indeed. I'm going to hand over to Neil now, turn off my camera, and we can all listen, sit back and listen. So thank you very much, Neil. Over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just going to bring up my presentation and make sure that I can see it in front of everything else that I've got up on my screen. Stop myself appearing over my slides. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me, and if anything goes wrong, then if you can put something to Janet and she kind of flag up if there's anything I need to attend to. I've also got builders outside neighbour's house working today, so if I might have to move if there's any kind of problem with noise coming through. So title of this afternoon's session is What Foucault has Philosophy Got to Do with Planning Enforcement. I suppose my first thank you is to the RTPI for letting me use the title and not have to change it for any particular reason. Thank you for coming this afternoon, because I think it's brave of people in an enforcement week which is full of very practical presentations to come to something labelled like this and to try and engage a little bit of philosophy with a bit of planning enforcement. So it's a bit of an ivory tower session. If you want to know what an ivory tower looks like, it looks very much like a 9-year-old's bedroom complete with bunting. So what I want to do this afternoon is just take you through a presentation, and there'll be opportunity for questions at the end. The presentation will be just me this afternoon, and we're going to do about 20 minutes or so of presenting and give space for questions as well. The origins of this session was travelling to what is our annual Wales Planning Enforcement Conference in Llandrindod, Wales. And in doing that, I usually travel up with director of RTPI Cymru, and one year we said, oh, wouldn't it be great to kind of do something that was kind of light-hearted, humorous, that engaged philosophy with planning enforcement. I think Rasheen who was traveling up with me, I'm not quite sure she understood what was going to be, but she resurrected that idea when Enforcement Week in its present format and presentations came around. So it's Rasheen's kind of fault that I'm here this afternoon speaking to you. So what I'm going to do is take you through a range of things, just trying to make a case for why planning enforcement officers, busy as they are, dealing with very pragmatic and practical things, maybe ought to sometimes attend to some philosophical thinking. And we're going to start with we're going to jump into a particular branch of philosophy, one that kind of takes us to thinking about one of those themes that's central to planning enforcement, and that is identifying breaches, identifying compliance with planning controls, and when they're broken. So we're going to do that. We're going to end up looking at some of the issues around throwing a theoretical lens, if you like, over some issues around surveillance of breaches of planning control. And I'm also going to put into this today something which I've researched more recently, which is one planet development in a Welsh context. So I'll explain what that is, but also how that is monitored. And so I think we can this idea of surveillance, controls, monitoring is going to flow through the session today. So if we kind of think about how I kind of, Janet kind of alluded to kind of some of my interest of, academically in enforcement is what are rules, why they're there, and when people break them. And I don't know if Birmingham City Council still uses this, but I kind of always liked it and kind of saved the image of, their planning enforcement charter at one point, what happens when the planning rules are broken. So academically, I'd like to take a look at this issue of, a set of rules, planning as a kind of suite of different rules that some people comply with, the majority comply with, but there are some people who find it very, very difficult to keep to rules, as I kind of alluded to in the introduction. People in the supermarket going the wrong way. Why can't you keep to the rules? So I'm not one who subscribes to the idea of rules are there to be broken. I think there are good reasons for most rules that we have, and good reasons for most planning rules. And what I've kind of looked at is some of the literatures and kind of inspired by reading others' work of how do we get people to comply with those rules? Because I suppose planning enforcement officers are largely dealing with a set of issues where people either find it challenging to comply with the rules, they don't know what the rules are, or they just don't like the rules and deliberately break them. So let's think a little bit about why then it might be appropriate for planning enforcement officers. What does enforcement need philosophy? Well, you can't give any kind of presentation on planning enforcement as an academic without referring to it as the Cinderella of the planning system, that kind of neglected, under-resourced element of the planning system. And I think if it remains that in an academic context, i.e. planning students at university don't get kind of think theoretically, conceptually and practically around planning enforcement, then it stands up as a poor cousin to all the other aspects of planning that might form part of a planning education. So I see it very much as kind of having a role in the planning curriculum to think critically around what planning enforcement is and what it does. Enforcement itself, kind of as you will know from doing it, is actually one of the more complex parts of the planning system. It's kind of crazy sometimes how it's not better resourced, it's not better skilled in a sense. So what I've been trying to do is just bring some theoretical ideas to kind of thinking about planning enforcement. So I kind of like the practice stuff, but I also like the theory stuff. And I think the main role I see as kind of working with theory and philosophy and bringing that to planning enforcement is it gives us a different way of seeing familiar problems. It might give us different ways of thinking about the problems that we regularly experience. So hopefully that's kind of a brief outline of a case for why we're here this afternoon. Hopefully kind of resonates with why you might have signed up to a session that looks at this. It's the post-lunch session, so a bit of Diet Coke to keep me going. Okay, so where are we going to start with our enforcement and philosophy? And I thought, well, where can we start? We'll start with a Forrest Gump kind of approach to planning enforcement. Enforcement is like a box of chocolates, his mama said. You never know what you're going to get. I think with planning enforcement, maybe you do know what you're going to get. You're probably going to get a lot of hard centers and some nuts in your selection of chocolates. But we're going to aim a little bit higher than a Forrest Gump, and we're going to go in our session today looking at some modern French philosophy. I guess that's a big jump, but nevertheless, bear with me. I'm going to keep you hopefully on the session as we get more and more to the practical things. And the philosopher that we're going to choose, and this is kind of almost conceived of as a presentation as the first in an occasional series of one. The first one that we're going to go to, and today's kind of philosopher that we're going to explore, is this guy, Michel Foucault, so one of the French philosophers of the modern era. And my first entry into his work was kind of looking at a book that he wrote and published in English in the late 1970s called Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. And what he was interested in was a whole series of different ways in which societies over centuries had gone from punishing people in very kind of public, quite dramatic ways, literally kind of hung, drawn and quartered for having committed an offence, to much more subtle ways of controlling populations through disciplining them. So his subtitle is The Birth of the Prison. And what he was looking at is kind of the prison, but also looking at how beyond the prison, now we have these disciplining mechanisms. We can have people become much more compliant, they learn to kind of follow rules and be good subjects, if you like. So he was looking at some really hefty ideas that I think you could make some initial connection to planning enforcement with, of controls and controls over the population and what they do, that those that kind of don't adhere to whatever the rules are, in this case planning enforcement, planning rules and their enforcement, would get punished in some way. And I know it's kind of say that planning enforcement activity and the expediency measure as to whether to enforce isn't about punishment. But nevertheless, Foucault was kind of writing around these things. So the thing I'm going to focus on mostly is this idea of surveillance that he was kind of featuring in his book. So I'm going to move forward now and just think a little bit about some of the more specific ideas he started to kind of borrow and use in his exploration of the birth of the prison and how populations were managed and disciplined. So if we kind of use this, he was mainly interested in how individuals were disciplined, and so that they became compliant subjects. They became people who kind of adhered to rules, and they were kind of educated in this. And there was a kind of more subtle ways in which people could be kind of encouraged to comply. And what I'm flagging up here as well is one of the things that he drew on heavily conceptually in his book, which was the Panopticon. Okay, so that's the first big word of today's session. And what that is it was kind of, I'll flag it up on the next slide as well, is he borrowed an idea around how prisons were designed. And I'll show you some images in a moment. But he borrowed this idea around prison design as a way of thinking about surveillance in society more generally. How do you kind of watch over what people are doing? And again, hopefully you can see connections between watching over people and detecting planning breaches. So he borrowed this idea of the Panopticon as something that enabled control of people, those in prisons in this particular case, so that they always thought that they were being watched. So even if they weren't being watched, he was kind of interested in this idea that people behave themselves, even if you're not watching them, if they think they are being watched. So that's what he meant by to arrange things. He was talking about physical prisons, but he was then kind of explodes that into how you organize towns and cities, etc. So that surveillance is of people and objects and things is permanent in its effect. You always feel that you are being watched, even if actually you're not. So he kind of comes up with other kind of phrases in his kind of text. This idea of thousands of eyes posted everywhere. And I'll come a little bit later to kind of having interviewed some enforcement officers, but actually I've got 300,000 enforcement officers in my kind of district, because he felt every person out there was helping them do the work of the planning and enforcement team. So the key thing is that Foucault was kind of thinking about how you arrange things, how you kind of make people feel that they're being watched, so that you kind of create governable people and governable places. So here we've got some of the imagery that kind of goes along with this kind of idea of a panoptic prison. So he kind of very much took the idea of a physical layout of an architecture and then took that idea and thought about it in a more theoretical way. And so I was thinking about, actually societies in which surveillance now spreads very wide through society. Because, you know, if we think of that, I was going through some old photographs the other day, proper photos that you took on a camera, sent away on a film and got back. If you think now about how easily monitored some things are, with people having kind of a phone that displays instant images that can be instantly shared in their pocket on their mobile phone. So we've got a kind of a society, and he was already pointing to a society in which surveillance activity spread more and more throughout society. And so everyone, he felt, you know, was becoming implicated in this kind of watching over each other. And again, he didn't kind of touch too focused in a focus field planning or towns, but nevertheless, kind of puts out this issue. Put a quote at the bottom by kind of Margot Huxley, kind of planning academic, working, so talking about this panoptica of suburbia, kind of in suburban life, the twitching curtains, looking over neighbours, seeing what they're doing. She felt that, you know, actually it was interesting to explore this idea that people now regulate themselves. They don't always need someone from, you know, the state or, you know, public body to be watching. They actually start to watch each other ourselves, and we do some of this surveillance function. The imagery on the slide, or some of them, kind of gives you this sense of this panoptic prison and its layout, with a central watchtower, and then each prison cell located in circular form around the watchtower, backlit so that the prisoner in their cell was always visible. You know, there was nowhere for them to hide. And the central watchtower sometimes had someone in it watching, but it wasn't obvious to the prisoner at what times you were being watched. So kind of a nice idea of him taking this kind of physical layout and taking it as a metaphor for thinking much more about how people engage in surveillance across society. So let's bring it back home to planning a bit more then. Let's think about, I want to cover now two things which bring it right down to planning, these kind of high level ideas taken out of the philosophy book, and how we kind of connect with them as planning enforcement officers and academics interested in planning enforcement. I'm going to look at how some of the surveillance practices work in reporting of planning breaches and using some of these kind of background concepts. And what I'm then going to also do is look at how, more specifically in a Welsh context, a phenomenon of one planet development. This is a form of low impact development in the open countryside, so residential use in open countryside for a low impact development. How we can take some of these ideas about self-monitoring and think what does that kind of teach us around how we could require those who get planning permission for something to be active in reporting to us as planners that they are compliant with things. So they're the two kind of practical things I'm going to make my way through. Firstly, I suppose it goes no surprise, anyone on the kind of on the presentation who's working in planning enforcement will know that actually tip-offs, anonymous tip-offs, if you accept them, are one of those key things that kind of give us this sense that there might be something going on a parcel of land or in a property that might require planning permission and doesn't have it. So we can see kind of, you know, when there was a spate of cases of people hiding houses within barns or behind hay bales, that actually sometimes it's only through anonymous tip-offs that we really become aware that there are breaches going on. And of course, the law afterwards caught up with a lot of this kind of hiding of breaches, etc. But it kind of highlights to us just the real importance of people passing sites, knowing that something's happening and reporting that to the local authority. I also kind of downloaded this kind of many years ago. I really liked that Windsor and Maidenhead was making it very, very easy for people to kind of put in complaint forms. So, you know, seeing this almost as this kind of chance of getting the population to kind of, you know, provide you with the information about what is going on. So this kind of idea of surveillance, encouraging people. I mean, students, when I kind of talk to them about this, I say, oh, people really snitch on their neighbours, and I think, well, yeah, sometimes they do. So, but, you know, here we've got a nice example of where making it relatively straightforward for people to engage in this kind of activity of informing the local planning authority that something is going on. And we see here, kind of, you know, where is it? You know, what's going on? Do you know who the owner or occupier is? Do you have any contact details? As part of what we might call a surveillance function. When I kind of spoke to some planning enforcement officers around how they kind of engaged with this kind of very kind of in-person surveillance, it was kind of interesting to look at how they cultivated sometimes the public as a source of information of what was going on site. And when I kind of interviewed some planners, they were kind of talking that they weren't quite sure about what the controls were over asking neighbours in a covert way to report on what their neighbours were doing if there was a suspicion that there was some enforcement breach going on. But nevertheless, some were kind of using this, creating the situation, if you like, where people would offer information. So they could have, thinking of the quote at the bottom, someone said, I don't think we ever ask anyone to really directly record anything about what's going on site where there might be a breach if they're a neighbour. But if you can provide us with as much information as possible, then we could possibly use that. This idea of using activity logs, getting people to report on the comings and goings of people to sites, what's happening, what's the vehicles that are turning up there. All this kind of interesting in thinking about planning and enforcement as a surveillance activity. And what we found is sometimes the public are really, really keen to do this. Sometimes going beyond what is requested, including videoing their neighbours, installing home security to be able to catch a neighbour and what their activities are on site. So kind of fascinating me is what kind of use is made of the public to support the surveillance activity, if you want to call it that, of planning enforcement teams. And of course, moving on from in-person surveillance, if you think about how technology has kind of enabled us to explore surveillance activity far more through society, then this idea that the city itself is an enormous panopticon, a place in which there's kind of rich data, there's visibility, there's surveillance activity of us all, map where people are going. So if we think about the test and trace system that many people are downloading to their phone now, a way of kind of identifying when people are in proximity to others and so on. But I looked at kind of sort of some of the technologies that planners were using. I thought CCTV is the kind of obvious bit in the academic literature where they say cities effectively fully surveyed now, and actually planners weren't really using it an awful lot. What they were interested in is some of the kind of the virtual Earth kind of material, virtual globe technologies that are coming through with Google, etc., using Earth and Street View. And what I get my students to do is kind of do a site inspection of a breach using Google to initially see what they can see by kind of doing that. And of course, just to flag up something that's coming, I think, tomorrow in this series of presentations, which I'm really keen to go on, is the increasing use of drone technology as a way of kind of expanding what planners can do in terms of surveying what's going on, including on difficult to access sites. So it comes back to this idea of kind of the surveillance functions kind of creeping and growing that we can use. I'm going to leave that there for now and move on to the second issue. So that's kind of thinking about how these kind of ideas about surveillance and control and regulation of people, drawn from philosophy and planning theory, can help us with reporting breaches. What I'm going to move on to now is something specifically from a Welsh context, which is the monitoring of one planet development. So I'm going to take you through a very specific kind of thing. Some of you might be familiar with this, others may not. So I'm going to briefly explain what it is. And the theme that I'm going to explore through it is self-monitoring, if you like, the assurance to a local planning authority that one is complying with planning rules, and that responsibility for doing that falling on the person who is being monitored. So the self-monitoring idea, I think, interesting as well. So to flag up what one planet development is, this is a form of low impact development. And in Wales, we have a planning policy context, which I'll come to in a moment, which enables this, that it enables dwellings in open countryside, subject to them being a land-based enterprise, and I'm cutting across a lot of detail here, subject to kind of meeting some specific ecological footprint criteria. So there's kind of a nice agenda of kind of trying to kind of reduce in Wales our ecological footprint to one planet living. And there's this experimental planning policy of a kind of low impact development. And I like the image in the middle, which is Simon Fairley's second edition of his book on low impact development more generally. And it's got the people kind of from Lammas, which isn't a one planet development, but it is a low impact development in a Welsh context, taking their planning application in a wheelbarrow to the planning department. So kind of taking these masses of information that they were required to show that there could be an exception to new residential development in open countryside if you showed that you could have meet certain ecological criteria. And that's the Lammas development there. So one planet development is development that through its low impact either enhances or does not significantly diminish environmental quality. And our planning policy context in Wales supports this. So there has to be, if you think of this kind of new residential development in open countryside, kind of contrary to kind of decades of planning policy, you'd expect this to be quite well kind of set up in terms of how to comply and what the rules are. So there's a policy, there's technical advice, and there's practical guidance as well on one planet development. If you're trying to imagine what these things are, then some people really didn't like when a previous presentation when I kind of used the image on the left of my screen, the Hobbit house style, one planet development, but on the right you see something which is again also a one planet development, a little bit more conventional looking, but nevertheless is in open countryside. This is kind of where you wouldn't normally allow a house, but you can allow it if it's a land-based enterprise that meets certain ecological footprint criteria. So to bring this a little bit back and reinsert a bit of that philosophy, and kind of whenever I see the word control, I kind of like what's going on here. In an appeal on a one planet development, so kind of many of these things in the early stages were refused and went to appeal. So we've got this kind of nice appeal statement here. While the Welsh Government supports the principle of low impact development, it places emphasis on the need to ensure it is properly controlled. So that kind of gets my kind of academic brain thinking, okay, what's going on here? What's this proper controlling going on? So this freedom to live in the countryside on a land-based enterprise supported by planning policy comes with a series of controls. And that's what I'm going to turn to now. So how do we do it? Well, kind of the One Planet Development Policy, because this kind of raises all sorts of compliance and enforcement issues as well, has basically a measure. So at Wales, we calculated our kind of, in 2011, it changes over time, but we calculated our ecological footprint. And so it comes out to 3.2.8 global hectares per capita. So it's kind of a land-based measure. How much land, productive land, do we each have if we divided it equally? And a One Planet Development has to kind of hit a much lower ecological footprint measure and have potential to move over time to something which is one planet living, which again moves over time depending on a number of factors, but is set here for the policy purposes as 1.88 global hectares. So to significantly reduce your ecological footprint. The schemes that we looked at kind of range quite significantly from really, really low ecological footprints to kind of some which are kind of getting close to what is permissible under the policy. So we've got a policy, we've got a kind of a measure of what a one planet development is. So let's think about how we kind of go about kind of checking that these people, surveilling or monitoring whether these people are complying. So there's a One Planet Development ecological footprint calculator. So this is something that someone submits as part of their application to show how they imagine through the land-based enterprise and this residential development in open countryside, is going to kind of stack up as ecological footprint. So there's a range of different kind of things you can put in. So my surveillance kind of mentality is starting to think, okay, this is kind of interesting. This is asking people for lots of information about their consumption behaviors that they expect to happen over the, initially and then over the next 3 to 5 years. So it's kind of, you've got this calculator, you can go and use it, and you can go and calculate whether your lifestyle will kind of allow you to kind of have the opportunity of living in a one planet development or getting permission for it. I'm flagging this up here as well on the basis that this gives some of the targets of a one planet development and it gives some of the indicators. And what I'm flagging up here is some of the information that the local planning authority require someone who lives in a one planet development to supply to the local planning authority at a certain point and thereafter annually. So there's an annual expectation that the person living in one planet development will kind of report on their annual food production, their spend on food, their annual household income, produce grown and reared on the site, etc., how much water they're using, and right down at the bottom, annual monitoring of all trips to and from the site by purpose, distance, mode, and any transport sharing. Now, if you think of what we're asking people to do here, we're asking them to provide us with information as a planning authority around a lot of things. Now, I'm trying to think, could you personally produce for me what all your trips to and from the site by purpose, distance, mode, and transport sharing for the past year? I certainly couldn't start to do that. So these people have been subject to quite a strict monitoring regime, and they are kind of having to report this data. We spoke to a number of people who were kind of thinking about living in or applying for one planet development. And so what's this with the record keeping? Why do you do it? And some people found this really quite burdensome. I can't possibly be writing down every item of food that I buy for 5 years, and it's not quite like that in practice. But nevertheless, we are really asking someone to do the self-monitoring of this activity. And I find it's kind of interesting how we can set up a plan Planning Commission that sets out quite a strict monitoring regime to ensure people are complying with the reasons why they've been given an exception to a planning policy. Other people are saying that if you're worried about it, it's basically like doing a tax record. And if anyone's done one of those, again, it's not very nice to do. And it requires you to go through lots of information over the past year. So some people are saying, well, it's not quite as burdensome to monitor and self-report as we were thinking. And finally, whether people felt, and I thought this was the nice tension in this particular way that we were ensuring compliance with these particular rules, was people say, I don't think it's fair that you are now asking me to report to you annually on all these things about my food consumption, my other sources of income, how much I'm earning, what trips I'm making. But it was seen by these people as necessary to enable this policy. So I really like the way that one person said, well, look, this is completely ridiculous, but it's completely necessary to enable this to happen as well. The interesting thing I think we're looking forward is that so many of these schemes, because this is a policy introduced in 2012, you get the planning applications, then you get a period of time to develop and comply with the ecological footprint measure, is that these are now starting to come up to whether they're hitting what we expect them to. And I haven't got much time to go into it, but there are exit strategies for any failure to comply. So this is really an interesting, I think, quite novel way of dealing with a particular kind of development by requiring people not to ask for us to check, but for them to report to the local planning authority annually on what they're doing. So I want to draw things to a close. We're going to got some time for questions that might come in as well. So I suppose, what Foucault planning philosophy got to do with planning enforcement? Well, maybe something, maybe nothing. If nothing else, then I think I don't want to end on this idea and bring it back to that philosophical point about Foucault drawing on this idea of a panoptic prison, and I think the image nicely captures some of that as well. So I could take back to that point by saying, the effect of the Panopticon to arrange things so that surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it's discontinuous in its action. So that a nice illustration, you can see much more clearly here in this photograph of the prisoner backlit, completely visible by the way we've organized things. Someone may be in that central tower watching them, but maybe not. But nevertheless, the effect of being watched or feeling watched is there. So hopefully you can start to see some of the potential connections we've got between this idea of planning enforcement teams maybe being under-resourced, maybe not having the resources to do a lot of the detection and investigation work that they need to do, but hopefully flagged up this idea. The more we can create the opportunities for people to feed that information to us, either about breaches, using technology to support surveillance activity and detection activity, and through the One Planet development, even flagging up that we can get people to do some of this themselves. We can get people to be compliant by setting out the requirement that they monitor their activity. So hopefully that has just been an interesting, maybe not quite as light-hearted and humorous as we've intended it to be, but nevertheless hopefully flags up a number of ways in which I think in a bit more critically, conceptually, reflectively, we can do some interesting things and think about how we do enforcement practice. So I'm going to conclude it there, and I'm going to hand back over to Janet, or if Jenny can stop the sharing, we can go back in, and then Janet can start dealing with some of the opportunity for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. Okay, so people out there, if you would like to submit your questions in the question box, and I can read them. Well, I'm hoping I can. Esmond Sage, are you someone? I think maybe we've got one question at the moment. So while you're thinking about it, just try and write some questions down. I know it's not the same as putting your hand up and speaking them, but I'm just going to start off with a question for Neil while you think about it. And I was wondering, and I'm particularly interested in the wheelbarrow full of papers that we all know is commonplace now for submitting a planning application. And I was wondering whether you think, Neil, and I'm sure that the audience may have a view on this as well, that whether the tremendous amount of bureaucracy that we have to submit now for planning applications make enforcement much more difficult than it was before. And if that's the case, then I wonder if you've got any views about whether or not the new planning reforms will propose, shall we say, let's say proposed in England anyway, they're for England only, whether they will make much difference. So just get going on that while I try and have a look at some of these questions. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'll need to look into kind of the England reforms in a little bit more detail to kind of be able to answer that part of the question. But certainly, I suppose, think, you know, if we can go and think a bit more abstractly again around rules and compliance, you know, that's where I would start. You know, the more information we've got, the more that there are rules, the more there are clarifications, the more there are qualifications and detailed information, the less clear a rule becomes. So again, I'm just thinking, you know, parallels that, you know, instantly think whenever I think about what could I bring into planning, think about the parallels that we've got now. I've been thinking, okay, well, you can't leave your home under the coronavirus restrictions. Wales has got extra restrictions coming from Friday evening where, you know, you can't leave your home except for, you know, X, Y, and Z. And then, oh, there's qualification on this, and then kind of more information on that. And suddenly kind of everything, the compliance, you know, so I'd argue that the compliance kind of deteriorates the more there's kind of detail, etc., for us to kind of, you know, try and break down the rules. So one of the other things I'm looking at the minute is linked to One Planet development is this exceptions that we make to rules. So I think, you know, the more there are exceptions, the more there are nuances, the less clear the rule becomes, the easier it is for people to kind of not comply or find it difficult to know what they've got to comply with. So yeah, and I think certainly on the kind of One Planet development, they're turning up, I think they were making a political point here as well about the nature of the planning system. You know, people, all they wanted to do was live within the Earth's resources. That's what they wanted to do. And they have to turn up with kind of ream after ream of paper, box after box in a wheelbarrow. So, you know, it's a nice picture that makes the point that we just want to live a really simple life in the countryside, living within environmental limits. And yet we have to do all this. And contrast with, well, if I want to go and live in a, you know, a standard house builder home, you know, 4-bed detached, 2 cars on the driveway, I don't have to do any of this. You know, so if they were trying to kind of draw a distinction between kind of something which was kind of, you know, complying with a policy objective, you know, getting us to live within the planet's resources, and yet to do that good thing, they were being asked to kind of, you know, engage in analyses of this, kind of providing evidence of things that we don't ever really, in living in standard bricks and mortar housing, have to do. And certainly we're not asked, once we've occupied the property, to show that we are doing anything in particular at all. So I think, you know, yes, some reflections there on that, but the England planning reforms, I haven't looked in enough detail to kind of be able to comment on whether I think they're going to lead to more or less compliance.
Okay, thanks. Well, we'll get, while you've been talking, there's quite a few questions coming in. So I'm going to save the first till the last because I think, so Esmond Sage, I'm not ignoring you, but Emma Green has asked, and I think it's relevant to what you've been saying about surveillance, could the need for a completion notice be a useful surveillance tool for complying with planning applications? And I think also quite relevant to that, have any of the One Planet development people been subject to an enforcement notice for failing to submit the annual information? Maybe you'd like to tackle those 2 questions, Neil, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay. One of the first things I ever did as a academic at Cardiff University was join a team that looked at, I forget what it was then, it was probably, I don't know if it's DCLG or even earlier kind of incarnation of it. And we did look at completion notices, which we concluded were kind of potentially quite useful, but always had that limitation of, well, you complete or you don't, and if you don't, then you've got a half-completed development. And so, yeah, we thought it was potentially quite an interesting part of the enforcement armory. But when we did the research project on it, which is some time ago, was a bit of a challenge. I suppose the notice that I think we haven't mentioned is, you know, the planning contravention notice. Kind of, you know, again, if I kind of put my French philosophy hat on, you know, I think, you know, we don't use them very much, and I suppose when we do use them, if people don't fill them in or return them, do we do anything subsequently to that? But, you know, that to me is kind of one of the ways in which, you know, putting a little bit of a theoretical perspective. Okay, what's that? What is that PCN? You know, it's a way of kind of demanding or kind of requiring or kind of, you know, encouraging someone to provide us with information about what they're doing. So I see even the PCN as a potentially seen through a surveillance lens, as a tool that kind of maybe we don't use well enough or don't kind of follow up on enough. The enforcement notice on the One Planet development, really interesting question. As I said, several of them are now, well, the early front runners are starting to come up to the point where they need to hit their One Planet footprint. So they're given an opportunity to start with above One Planet living and have the potential to, over time, to achieve 1.88 global hectares per capita, which is your One Planet living measure. And if they don't do that, well, I suppose there's two questions. There's one, do you submit the report and it's not achieving it, or do you not submit the report? I suppose, what are the consequences? And I suppose interesting future for what's going to happen here in kind of requiring people to monitor and submit information. First of them, I think, is that the consequences are quite significant potentially for not doing so, in that when you submit your One Planet development, you get your permission for it, you have to have submitted an exit strategy. So you have to kind of explain, if you don't kind of meet the One Planet living, there is a kind of traffic light system of saying, okay, we haven't quite met One Planet living, but what are you going to do to get back on track? Because again, this is something we want to encourage, because we want to encourage, innovate and experiment with what living within planetary measures is. So if you kind of, there's a possibility of saying, well, you haven't quite met it, but if you give us a plan that meets it, and shows you will get there, you just need a bit more time, then you can accommodate that. If something is completely failing as a One Planet development, then what we've got the opportunity to do is invoke that exit strategy. So what does that mean? Typically, it means that the residential component of the development may have to be dismantled, removed, etc. So the sanctions are quite significant, I think. People have invested a lot of time and effort in establishing a land-based enterprise with a residential element. To lose that would be really quite significant. So, it's not easy to get a One Planet development. It takes a lot of effort, and it takes effort to deliver it as well. So I suggest that the reasons to comply are quite significant in that case. But I haven't got anything yet where I don't know of any cases yet where someone hasn't submitted it and there's been enforcement action. But again, the expediency test would clearly be still relevant here. What would you do if someone continued to refuse, but it was almost One Planet living? Do you want to go heavy-handed on it, or do you want to kind of take an approach of encouraging people to, they're probably living much more sustainably than we are already.
So actually, Leslie Smith, he's sent in a question about sanctions and resources. And I know this is a really big issue for planners across the whole of the UK now, how well resourced we are. Have you got any comment? His actual question is, what is the point of surveillance if there are no resources for action and insufficient sanctions for punishment?
Yeah, I suppose interesting question around okay, well, there's no point gathering I suppose kind of express it a different way. There's no point gathering information if you're not going to do anything with it, or you can't do anything with it. And I suppose one of the things that, if you haven't got the resources to do anything, then how could you get others to do the resource? So I suppose one of the things on the One Planet development, again, to illustrate the point, you've got people doing the monitoring of themselves here, and then they kind of have to report that to you. But there's still a resource issue and an expertise and skills issue, because how are you going to interpret that information? And do you know what it, will you chase it if it doesn't come in? Have you got a good record of which One Planet developments you're expecting to supply you with information? I remember going back to that limited period in practice, which is a very short period, but nevertheless, the whole issue of agricultural occupancy conditions, unless you've got people certifying that they're complying with something, and you find that actually someone's been non-compliant for 12 years and suddenly the condition is no good to anybody. So on that point, on the resources, yeah, it still needs resources. It's not a resource-free issue. Coming back to the idea of, well, maybe some people will comply if there's a kind of an increased chance that they will be kind of identified as having committed a breach. Some people will get away with things because they think they'll get away with it, which brings us back to the issue of sanctions. I suppose one of the issues in the kind of taking the philosophical approach that we did today was, is the celebration of the punishment. So again, I remember a few years ago looking at one local planning authority which was really, really good celebrating on its website when it had successful enforcement action. You know, the use of the media to publicize this. So again, you might not have the resources to do everything that you want to do, but celebrating those where you have taken action might then be something that people see, oh right, yeah, well, you know, it's not sanction free here, and you might be the unlucky one that gets caught out if you haven't got resources to do it all.
I think on the same thing, Peter White asks what enforcement officers can do now within existing rules to encourage compliance and maybe surveillance. And he also asks, which will lead us on to some other questions about what we should avoid. I think the latter part of that question is very much a question for today, and this whole idea of people spying on their neighbours in the COVID crisis. Would you like to comment on that? What should we avoid? And there's a couple more questions around that, actually. So maybe I'll read the other ones out then. So Esmond Sage said that he wrote, quite interestingly, normatively or ethically speaking, is panopticism something we should be comfortable with or encourage more of in planning enforcement? And that certainly comes round to this whole idea of whether surveillance is ethical or not. And you touched on that in your talk, of course. So I think those two questions together are quite interesting. Okay.
Yeah, maybe next year we'll come back and do something on ethics. So it might be a series of two. You never know. What to do to secure compliance? I suppose what were some of the easy things? You know, make the rule simple. You know, the simpler things are, the more people know what the rule is. If there's confusion about the rules, then it becomes challenging. So, you know, I'm old enough to have worked with, for example, committed the GPDO going back, you know, 25 years, and looking at certainly your English version now, and I just think, goodness me, you know, way back then it was a lot easier to know whether something is or isn't permitted. We didn't really argue about too much about it, but you know, so many things have been inserted in caveats, qualifications, etc. That, you know, so what we can do, simplify our rules. I think that's where we start. You know, more compliance when the rules are simpler. People know what they are for a start. Because again, this coronavirus. Am I allowed to take my kids down the park in Wales? So playgrounds stay open after Friday in Wales, and it's not a planning example, but you know, so I've got some of my daughter's friends' parents saying, "Oh, we could all meet down the park on the weekend." No, you can't, because there's a little qualification. So, you know, complicated rules don't help us. And some things to avoid, I suppose, those things that if we were to kind of make a big issue that we kind of had taken action against something might be seen as insensitive. And I suppose thinking about how the One Planet development things might go. You know, if these are people that are living sustainably, they become part of their community, they're supplying local produce to the local town, the village, etc. If you start to kind of celebrate taking action against these people who are living really sustainably, just because they're not fully compliant with something, then it might get a bit of a backlash. So thinking about those type of issues. Ethics, I think, I didn't have enough space to start to touch upon the ethics of encouraging people to shop their neighbours in, etc. And some of the ethics of planning enforcement officers who might encourage that, or it's hard for us to take enforcement action unless we've got good information. I can't directly ask you to covertly survey your neighbour, but I could maybe say, well, if the complaint's sort of not I will and whole issue around anonymous complaints, forcing people to say, well, we won't kind of follow up a complaint that's made anonymously. You've got to tell us who you are, etc. So there are ways in which planners elicit information, very practically, but there's a whole ethics of this and the whole panopticism. This brings us back, if we want to go and explore the kind of theory a bit more, the whole Foucault thing, that bit of French and modern philosophy, seen as control, but actually seen as productive as well. So I think there's a lot more for us to potentially explore outside the session as well. Is this ethical? Is kind of knowing lots about what people are doing something that we should be doing and promoting? So it comes back to, I think, that kind of freedoms and controls, and that's what I think runs through the One Planet development thing really nicely. These people said to us, I want to live a free life in the country, but look at all the stuff I've got to do. I report annually on how I travel, what I eat. So there are controls. So these two things go together. But yeah, I think there's a lot ethically to think about for planners. And I suppose one of the interesting things, this session was billed as maybe being interested to people who were on the experienced practitioner APC route. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But nevertheless, I suppose one of the things the RTPI says in their applications for APC is that ethics tends to be one of those things that we don't reflect on enough. And I suppose if today is just flagged up, actually, in taking this panoptic approach to planning enforcement, if that's what you want to do, there are all sorts of ethical issues bundled up with that. I think I really kind of like the fact someone's flagged up ethics as part of today's session.
And I think Mark Tansley has written a quite interesting point that says that despite the enforcement officers, that we town planners, that we think that enforcement is the point of it is to remedy rather than to punish, whereas politicians and maybe local people think we should punish. So do you want to just comment on that? That statement is a good and interesting one, I think.
Yeah, I think going back a long time, I thought it always struck me as interesting that if you're saying it's not about punishment, it's not about punishment. Maybe it is a little bit about punishment potentially. So yeah, formally, I suppose if we're kind of complying with kind of what we're the remedy is what's important. The kind of dealing with the harm, if you like. But coming back to the point that someone said earlier, well, what sanctions have we got? So I suppose it's policing, I suppose, has parallels, doesn't it? And traffic wardens, all these kind of regulatory fields have these kind of parallels. Do you give someone a parking fine, or do you say, excuse me, you're causing an obstruction, and move on? And I suppose moving someone on because they're causing an obstruction is the remedy, but plenty of people get parking fines, so they get the punishment as well. So I think while we say it's not about punishment, and it isn't, and anyone pursuing punishment's kind of again got more ethical stuff to think about, but nevertheless, I think the celebration that people have had to, I used to just think of the TV programs that I forget which one they were, but the ones where someone goes in, you demolish someone, direct action. You go in, you demolish someone's thing, property that's been built unauthorized. You've gone through a whole enforcement process. You demolish it, and then you kind of store materials and charge people for storing it. So I think if there are, I think there are punishment elements to a lot of this, even if it's not the intent.
Yes, I think there have to be sanctions in place, don't they? Presumably, as the disincentive to. I can name various remedies in my own neighbourhood where people have done things just to remedy a problem rather than rather than enforcement taking place, when sometimes enforcement might have been better. Okay, so we'll go to the last question, which is a futuristic question from Tracy Horner. And Tracy says, so how do you see planning enforcement in the future? What's the future of planning enforcement, Neil?
Oh, crikey. Thinking long term, out of what we've looked at today, planning enforcement, I suppose it hasn't changed an awful lot in all the time I've known and studied and explored it. And so if I go way back to when I was a student, just coming back off the Carnwath report, you think, well, it hasn't really changed, and it doesn't seem to have changed an awful lot. I suppose the technologies are a little bit interesting as to what potential they offer. And I'll be attending as a delegate tomorrow at the drone session, because I'm kind of interested in thinking about how technology. So I suppose technology, think about future of enforcement, whether the technologies and whether access to other forms of data might be useful. And I know there's all sorts of rules about access to data, what you can use it for, etc. But sometimes data spills out of what we meant to use it for. So I've got colleagues do GIS stuff who are kind of very excited about mobile phone tracking data that they can use to kind of map where people are moving. But so I suppose there's all that. So maybe a modest development. Out of today's session, I just take that idea of self-compliance, reporting, monitoring. So if we're trying to take that one planet development idea and apply it to a regular house building site, okay, prove to us that actually you are reducing your travel, etc. Because the one planet development, the development is the continuing existence of the residential element on the site is contingent on compliance. There's a loss of something. So I think maybe there are things about how we kind of use broader range of tools to kind of promote us moving towards living within environmental limits, but not just for one planet development, but for a broader range of activities, really. Setting up a monitoring framework, getting that information supplied to you. So potentially interesting issues there, but the main thing I'd like to go back is the technology. Let's see what if anything, offers us, and reflect on how we do enforcement differently, if at all, through using it.
Well, I must say I really like this idea of self-monitoring, especially in relation to large housing developments, modern house building, where clearly there are a lot of issues arise. I'm sure the enforcement officers online would confirm this. Well, I think there are no more questions, but I think we've had some good ones, and quite thoughtful, very thoughtful things, made us really look ahead, and you've helped us a great deal in this. So can I thank everybody who's here, still a lot of people online listening, and thank you very much. And I know it's not as easy as normal, but it's been good. And thank you most of all, of course, to Neil for giving such an interesting talk that's raised eyebrows, if nothing else, as well as making us think. That's good. And to the RTPI for setting all this up, the organisers. So I think that's it now, and thank you all for coming. Thanks very much, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheerio. Bye.
Bye.